Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about James Little and his family at your relaunch event for the Meeker Herald. It's a tribute to this community that in these days when newspapers are going under at an alarming rate, the community has gotten behind its newspaper to keep it going. I spoke about James 8 years ago when you all celebrated the 130th anniversary of the paper, and that was a lot of fun. Um, but I've updated the presentation, added a few things, and I hope you'll enjoy this. So just to show you how I hook up to James, my husband is Bill Little, son of Rich and Becky Little, grandson of Dick and Jesse Little, and great-grandson of James, founder of the Meeker Herald, and his wife, Selena. And by the way, Bill and I would like to say hi to any cousins and friends who are here today. We used to visit Meeker often when we lived on the Front Range, but now we're in Florida, so we don't get there very often anymore. But from the time James Little founded the paper in 1885 till when it was sold to the Cooks in 1964, three generations of Littles worked on the Meeker Herald. James, of course, his youngest son, Richard Gibson Little, known as Dick, and Dick's son, Richard Gibson Little Jr., known as Rich. Now, what this 1992 tribute doesn't tell us, of course, is that Dick's wife, Jessie Gillis Little, also worked for the paper, as did their daughters, Margot Little Coons and Betty Little Oldland. Now, James Little was born in 1858 in Northern Ireland. He was the second son of Joseph and Mary Ann Dunlap Little. And you'll notice they spelled their names with an I. More about that later. This is the church in the village of Barra in County Tyrone. That's the village where James was born. The parents and the 7 children born in Ireland came to America in 3 groups. First, Joseph and 3 of the children in 1867, and then Mary Ann with newborn daughter Sarah Jane, and then in 1869, James, age 11, and his younger siblings, John and Anne, made the journey. Now, the close-up of the passenger list here shows that James was 14. That was the age of adulthood in terms of this particular passenger line. That was the age that he could be in charge of his little brother and sister. So that was a little fib. But since no other adult was available to come with them, James had to take care of John and Anne on the voyage from Ireland to America. The family settled in Pittsburgh, and you can see them here in the 1870 census. The father, Joseph, is a day laborer. James works at a printing office. Robert is a cook on a steamboat, and John works in a nut factory. So all the older boys went to work pretty much right away and at quite young ages. Anne and Margaret are at school, and the rest of the children are at home, including Martha, the last one there, the first child born in the US. When he was about 17, James left Pittsburgh for Chicago, where he worked as a printer for the Chicago American newspaper. This is a 20th century photo of their building in downtown Chicago. The 1880 census shows him in Chicago boarding with the family of another printer named John Maitland, but James is always looking for something better, as did many young men at the time, and soon he was headed further west. He spent about a year in Denver working for the Daily Tribune, which was a paper that was published from 1871 to 1884. This is the earliest picture we have of James. But very soon, the lure of the mountains, and particularly the gold fields in the mountains, caused him to move on again. Now, this is a page from the 1884 Leadville City Directory. showing James as a printer living at 508 East 7th Street in Leadville. He was working for the Leadville Herald at this time, and we can see his name is spelled with a Y, though one thing family history research teaches us is that spelling didn't really become standard until well into the 20th century. We can find our ancestors' names spelled in countless ways. And look who else is in the 1884 Leadville City Directory. Doc Holliday. James was there as well in 1885 with the I back in his name, still working for the Herald as a printer. And the second column shows that he was also financial secretary of the Leadville Typographical Union, so of his trade union. Now, this is the first record we have of the kinds of leadership positions that James would be involved with all his life when he was in Meeker. Here's James in Leadville still in the 1885 Colorado State Census. He's rooming with a fellow printer, Henry Wildhack, who had come to Leadville in 1880 from Illinois. And Wildhack ended up coming to Meeker in October of 1886. And as he tells it, he took immediate charge of the mechanical department of the Meeker Herald, which position I held until between 1912 and 1916, gradually withdrawing from the work. So Wildhack was associated for quite a number of years with the early Meeker Herald as well. At the time that this census was taken, though, James would not be in Leadville much longer. Now, there's a typewritten manuscript from 1934 about the history of Meeker that's held by the Colorado State Historical Society. And it was put together by the U.S. Civil Works Administration, which was a very short-lived Depression-era jobs program. And the manuscript contains a history of James Little. Now, it's not absolutely clear who the source of this information was, but I believe that it was James's son, Dick, who also succeeded him as editor of the Meeker Herald, because in my research on the family, I've seen very similar accounts of James's life in other places that were attributed to Dick. So this is what Dick has to say about James's time in Leadville. Printing, of course, was his trade, but like nearly everyone in Leadville at that time, he got the mining fever. Every time a few of them got a few dollars ahead, they headed for the hills to prospect. Mr. Little had a number of silver claims on the Blue River near Breckenridge, which he developed and retained title to for years after he came to Meeker. And Dick goes on to say, in 1884, Mr. Little made a trip to the headwaters of the White River on South Fork, where there was established the mining camp of carbonate. At that time, he heard of Meeker and its many possibilities. The next June, so 1885, Mr. Little rode horseback from Leadville to Meeker to look over the prospects of starting a newspaper at this point. Now, after his 1884 visit, James wrote a letter to George Hazen in Meeker asking about the prospects for a newspaper in the town. And though he was living in Leadville, he wrote this as if he were in Denver. Maybe that he thought that gave him more credibility. This letter is the first time I've found that he signs his name with a Y. James says, will you please inform me whether there is a paper published at Meeker or not? And if not, what is there to support such an enterprise in your town? What population has the town got, and what is its future prospects likely to be? You will confer a favor on the undersigned by giving what information you can on the subject. Now, the following month, Mr. Hazen, who was county judge, notary public, deputy county treasurer, and real estate agent, so a man of many hats, wrote back telling James what kind of income he could expect from legal notices and advertising. Hazen says the business here for the support of a paper would be a general business. First, the county work, which is legal notices that are required to be posted in the paper, would amount to about $300 from clerk's office. Court business, about $200 more. Advertising from land office in Glenwood Springs, about $500. General business on general matters, $500 more. Then Routt County printing could be obtained, which would be as much more. He continues, Meeker is only about 1 year old, population about 175 now. About 20,000 head of cattle will winter here. This is probably the best stock range in Colorado. It is the old Ute Reservation. Now, evidently, James liked what he heard, because he was soon off to Meeker on that 1885 trip to see the place for himself. And here's what Dick said about James's first visit to Meeker. Mr. Little was never of robust physique, and when he reached Meeker, he was all in. Ed Wilbur tells the story how he came into Mrs. Wright's hotel and slumped down in a chair. Ed was tending bar at that time, and as he looked over at the stranger, he said, "Feller, you look like you need a drink." And that was his introduction to the town that was to become his home. He says Mr. Little received plenty of encouragement from the citizens, and he headed back to Leadville to gather together an outfit. In other words, to purchase the items that he would need in order to start a newspaper. Now, this is a bill of sale from the 15th of June, 1885, when James purchased at a Lake County constable's sale the equipment that he would need for his new enterprise in Meeker, including the press that is in the White River Museum, cases of type, 4 chairs, a dictionary, and other items for $190. Dick tells us that Red Cliff was the end of the railroad at that time, and the outfit had to be freighted to Meeker from that point. Now, if you've seen that printing press in the museum, you know that how very, very heavy it is. And you know that shipping that and everything else by freight wagon cannot have been easy. But everything arrived safely in July 1885, and James and his partner Jack Houston set up shop. They set up shop in this building, which stood where the Oddfellows Hall is now. James was 27 years old, no longer a printer, but now an editor of a newspaper. But the first issue of the Herald was not without its issues. Dick tells us Mr. Little and Mr. Houston set about to get out the first issue of Meeker's new paper. It was all ready to go and was scheduled to come out on August 8th, 1885. The night before press day, there was a high wind that blew mud from the building all over the type. This delayed the first issue until the next week, August 15th, 1885. And shortly after, Houston left the paper and became postmaster of Meeker. So James was on his own. In the opening editorial, James and his partner laid out their vision for the paper. Our opening overture will be brief. We will pass over the long-felt want phrases and proceed to lay down our platform. After a short visit to Meeker some time ago, we concluded that the country was good enough for us, and the consequence is the Meeker Herald, which is now before the citizens of Meeker and the White River country as candidate for their support and patronage. The Herald will not run in the interests of the rascals out or the rascals in other words, the politicians. We will confine ourselves to the local interest of Meeker and the White River Valley, and we will at all times, to the best of our ability, promote and protect the same. The Herald will not be the medium through which private parties can air their personal grievances. We are not here exclusively for the benefit of our health although we will have to acknowledge that the climate is delightful and the balmy and exhilarating air all that could be desired. The Herald will be conducted as a business enterprise. Now, one thing I appreciate every time I read something from the Herald is that James had an interesting sense of humor. Here he says, advertise in the Herald. You will get there every time. In the last issue, J.W. Welch advertised a team and wagon for sale and sold the layout by Tuesday. And a couple of weeks ago, George Winter advertised for a bridle that had been stolen from Mrs. Burke's stables. Next morning, the thief returned the bridle. In a recent issue, Mrs. Burke made known through our columns that she had received a barrel of Forester's old bourbon. In just 4 days, there wasn't a drop of it in the house, and we never had a drink of it. The Mossback who says that advertising don't pay is a century behind the time, and don't you forget it. And one more little example of James's humor from the paper. When a cold spell lights down in this section, it has been customary for the man who has been here since the bed of the river was dug to exclaim, "No, this isn't cold. You ought to have been here one winter during the time when the soldiers were here. Why, it was 40 below all the time." Well, last Sunday morning, the old timer was staggered for once. It registered 42 below in front of the Meeker Hotel at 5 a.m. And this was not the only place where the thermometer took a tumble in the beginning of this week. Reports from all over the state indicate that it was intensely cold at nearly every point. Now, this is a page from James's 1886 reporter's notebook. It's pocket-sized, and I can imagine him walking the streets of Meeker, greeting folks and looking for news, which he scribbles down in his notebook so he doesn't forget it. And here he notes that Jewell and Wolfe put a bridge across 4th Street this week, that Mr. McNeil has died, and that Tom Little, who owned a saloon in town, invites all persons to come and settle, in other words, to pay their outstanding bills. In a place like Meeker, business would have been done on credit, which could cause a hardship for merchants and service providers who had their own bills to pay. The proving up of the Meeker town site in July 1887 was a big event, as you might imagine. The town had been incorporated and a board of trustees was elected in 1885, and now folks could purchase land. And you can see that James was one of the trustees on the first town board. And he was also quick to purchase land in town. You can see here also on the front of this deed to James for land in Meeker that Reuben Oland, whose grandson Alan would marry James's granddaughter Betty, was the recorder of deeds at the time. In 1889, James began a correspondence with Selina Doak, a high school teacher whose family lived across the street from James's in Pittsburgh. They would conduct a long-distance romance by letter for several years. And this is an 1890 photo of Selina at the reunion of the Pittsburgh High School class of 1880. In his letter to Selina of December 25th, 1889, James described the state of the town that he hoped to entice her to come and live in. He says, "Our new church is coming on nicely, and the stonework will soon be finished. We have one of the best ministers in Colorado or anywhere else. He is not only a very able divine, but a splendid fellow socially. His wife is a jolly and charming lady." And James was instrumental in the founding of St. James's Church. In the same letter, he goes on to talk about the Masons in town. The Masonic fraternity will soon have their organization perfected here. Quite a number of very nice people have been added to the population lately, and more are coming. The outlook for Meeker is exceedingly promising, all of which makes me feel good. In Dick's account, he tells us more about the Masons. He says shortly after coming to Meeker, Mr. Little joined the Masonic Lodge at Glenwood Springs. From that time, he took a leading interest in forming a lodge in Meeker. The Herald office was the first lodge room in Meeker, and it was within its confines that the Rio Blanco Lodge got its start. This is an article from a neighboring newspaper congratulating the Herald on 5 years in business in 1890 and describing the progress that Meeker has made. It says the past year has been the most eventful in the history of the White River Valley, as it has witnessed the creation of Rio Blanco County after long and persistent efforts on the part of the people of the valley. Meeker has kept pace with the general advancement, having added to the public improvements a $10,000 schoolhouse and had in course of construction, in other words, the construction is underway, a $15,000 flouring mill, several handsome business houses and dwellings, and other evidences of substantial progress are apparent on all sides. But on September 24th, 1892, this appeared in the Herald. The Herald changes hands with this issue, the undersigned having sold the plant and business to Henry A. Wildhack, who has long been connected with the paper in the capacity of general assistant. The immediate cause of the change in proprietorship was brought about by the hired man on Wednesday last, demanding $334.05 in wages due to him. And James goes on to say that when this has happened before, when he's gotten a little behind on his financial obligations, he's gone to the bank and borrowed enough to see him through, but that he can't keep doing that indefinitely. And the article continues, the present request to liquidate, taken in connection with a mortgage on the outfit for $800, together with interest on the same, due the 10th of next month, told us in unmistakable terms that we had about reached the end of our rope in the glorious but profitless career of running a live and progressive paper for the benefit of a constituency who, judging by the slowness manifested in paying their subscription and other accounts, must have thought that the Herald could exist on beautiful scenery and a salubrious climate alone. So, doing business on credit with the customers of the Herald has finally caught up with James. But less than 2 months later, James is back at the helm, thanks to a group of Democrats in Rio Blanco and Routt counties who were concerned about the politics of the new owners. So the bill of sale on the left certifies that James is again the owner of the paper. Jimmy, as he calls himself in this article, announces the news and he articulates his new vision for the Herald. He says the Herald has again changed hands. On Monday of this week, the undersigned purchased Mr. Hayes' interest in the Herald and sufficient of Mr. Wildhack's interest to give me control of the property. This result was brought about through the instrumentality of a number of Democratic friends in this and Routt counties who last week inaugurated a movement to raise funds with a view to the purchase of the Herald and to reinstate Jimmy in the editorial chair. The final paragraph here says, the Herald will be Democratic. It will be run in the interest of the Democrats of Rio Blanco and Routt counties. As under my former management, nothing calculated to promote the general welfare of this county will be left undone. And last but not least, it will be run more in the interests of the undersigned than formerly. So I think that probably means no more credit for the customers of the Herald. Now this is James in front of the Herald building on 4th Street, which was the newspaper's home for 92 years. And James was very involved with the civic and political life of Meeker during his entire time there. This is again from Dick's account. Mr. Little was elected county superintendent of schools of this county in 1890 and held that office for 2 years. He was also an early day game warden and had many interesting experiences with the Indians and the Browns Park Bunch while holding that office. Mr. Little was a member of the first city council and later mayor of Meeker. He served for 2 terms as representative in the state legislature. And we have here James's candidate card for the Colorado House when he was running for the legislature. And here he is on the roll call of the House of Representatives in 1902. Now, on the home and family front, finally, in 1895, at the age of 37, James convinced Selina to be his wife, and they were married in Pittsburgh in August. James and Selina raised 3 sons in Meeker, in this house on Park Avenue. And if you look closely, you can see James on the porch with Selina and 2 of their sons. Now, the older boys, Hugh and George, both graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis and spent entire careers in the Navy. The youngest son, Richard Gibson Little, began working for the paper in the 19-teens and took over the Herald on the death of James in 1925. And he's on the right in this photo of the interior of the newspaper office. James died May 25th, 1925, at the age of 67, 40 years after he came to Meeker with the newspaper outfit that he had bought at a constable's sale in Leadville. Now, I know that he would be proud that you all haven't given up on the Meeker Herald, and many thanks for letting me tell you about James today. If you have any questions about my research on James, this is my email address, annette@heritagedetective.com. Enjoy your relaunch celebration, and thanks again for having me.